Good evening. I'm Claremont Featherstone inviting you to Security Focus. This evening, I would like to touch on a few pertinent matters, perhaps three or so. One has to do with a long outstanding matter that affects our military or former members of the military. Several years ago, I met with President Bart Jagdeo. Actually, I was interviewing him, and he did inquire about what I did outside of those interviews. And I said I was involved in the security industry, and he told me that he has been seeing some of my work appearing in the media and so forth. And I indicated to him that there was this plan afoot to form a professional body in Guyana whereby we can validate or credential security practitioners, but more so, members of the military or former members of the military. And he did say that when we are up and ready, we could very well write him a letter or indicate to him that we were about ready, and he would see what he could do to assist the process. So a few years after, once we have gone through with the development of the body, I wrote then President Bart Jagdeo a letter, and he furthered that letter to Minister of Home Affairs at the time, Mr. Clement Roy. We met with Mr. Roy and Mr. Floyd MacDonald, and it was a good meeting. In the end, Mr. MacDonald, who did most of the talking, said that he did not feel that it was wise for the government to assist to resettle members of the military. He said in clear language that if we in the private sector want to employ members of the military, we can do so, and it is our duty to provide them with the necessary training and retooling, and it should be part of the former soldier's motivation as well to retool himself and get himself ready for the next environment. And this is a good position, save and except for the fact that the government has assisted with the resettlement of members of the military for many years, particularly in Commonwealth countries. So many years have passed since then, and I had occasion to meet with Mr. Bart Jagdeo perhaps earlier this year, late last year, and we did touch on that very topic. And I said to him, I told him what transpired. And he says, well, you know, many people tend to see me as a dictatorial person, a person who likes to micromanage. But he said, a case like that, had you come back to me, I would have probably given you all $1 million. And I would have given you it on the basis that the government gives money to sports, they give money to arts, to music, and I couldn't see why the government would not want to or could not give $1 million or $1.2 million to a professional body that was helping to resettle or validate or credential former members of the military. Since then, not very much has been done in Guyana, as far as I know, with respect to aiding the transition process of military officers from the military into civilian life, and particularly as it relates to them being absorbed into the private security industry. So, it is the view of many in the industry that the majority of problems presented in the private security sector is presented by and large by former members of the military. And very often, the problems increase exponentially as the member spends longer in the military. So I recalled interviewing Mr. Morgan, Colonel, and he says, well, you know, the problem facing soldiers has to do with the fact that the Army is a total institution. And the soldier is trained to operate in a platoon environment. When the soldier goes back into civilian life, he takes with him many of the skills and the attitudes inculcated by the Army. And he finds it difficult, very often, to shed them like a cloak and thereby do the kind of things that the private security environment requires of him. But I have found that the officers that seem to have the greatest difficulty adjusting are the most senior members of the military, those who would have left as a full colonel or thereabout, because they would have spent about 25, 30 years in the military. And what we have been seeing, and at least for the last 20 to 30 years, we have seen a trend where many of these senior officers were given senior security executive jobs in the private sector. And for lack of information, many of them have faltered seriously and have not been able to put forward their best. So we are at this stage where we want to ensure that our security industry is well prepared for 2020, 2021. And we do not want a situation where foreigners will come, whether colonels or otherwise, to take up the senior security positions in our country. So we have to revisit this issue of doing something tangible to assist members of the military in their transition to civilian life, and more particularly their resettlement in the private security industry. When we come back, I will deal with a few other important matters to the security sector. Stay tuned. Security Focus is brought to you by Regium International, Northwest Investment Inc., Intelligard Specialist Security Services, and the Institute of Security and Public Safety. Recently, the Minister of Home Affairs, the Commissioner of Police, and the delegation from the Chinese Embassy met to discuss matters pertinent to security and threats, as it were, as it faced the Chinese business community. The minister, in an attempt to allay the fears of the Chinese delegation, said, well, you know, the threat currently facing the Chinese business men and women are essentially not targeted. They are spontaneous, they are opportunistic, etc. in nature. I beg to differ. The crimes committed against the Chinese community are targeted acts of criminal victimization. If you were to look at the statistics coming out of Europe, for example, the statistics coming out of other parts of South America, Africa, North America, you find a specific trend. From the time the Chinese businessmen leave China, they are members of the Chinese mafia on those flights. And those people are in constant contact with underworld groups all over the world. So it was found that there are times when the Chinese are traveling outwards, they discover that their wallets and large sums of money has misplaced on a flight. And when searches are carried out, you find money under seats, large sums of money in toilets and the like. And people fail to claim bags or handbags that they would have stashed money in, which belonged to the Chinese. So the Chinese are being targeted from the time they leave China. Last year and the year before, about 100 million Chinese left the Chinese mainland for holiday and business trips in other parts of the world. And they spend large amounts of money when they go there. In some of those jurisdictions, the Chinese are faced with acts of sabotage. And I'll give an example. In Trinidad and Tobago, perhaps a year or two ago, there was a situation where somebody skinned a dog, degutted it, and hung it on the fence of a Chinese businessman. Perhaps an immature prank. But at a later date, a minister of the government, in referring to that matter, said that something to the effect that they noticed the stray dog population in and around Port of Spain has been diminishing, and they wondered why. So the Chinese are being sabotaged because many local business people believe that the Chinese are receiving favorable treatment and the people are responding in all sorts of ways. The Chinese are not integrated into the local population. That is one problem facing any immigrant population. The Chinese do not speak English well. They are a reserved people and are often reluctant to report acts of victimization to the police. This is another feature of immigrant populations. The Chinese are afraid to report these matters because they are often afraid of reprisal. That is another reason. The Chinese are sometimes, like other immigrants, afraid to go to the police because they fear that the police might very well be on the side of the locals. Immigrant problems again. The Chinese, like all other immigrants, are afraid at times to go to the police because they are afraid of being sent back home if their documents are not in order. And most immigrant populations have these kinds of problems. And like everything else, when the Chinese population grows, they come with everything, including their criminal forms. So that the Chinese that are here have among them members of the Chinese triads, and these are very, very complicated criminal groups. They come with them and they keep tabs on what they are doing. And so many times when the Chinese are robbed, you are looking at a straight inside job. So let us address the issue of armed robbery per se. Armed robbery is essentially a predatory crime of attrition. A predator takes you by surprise. A predator is there to plunder. No sooner does the predator arrive, the predator leaves, so that the predator uses the element of surprise to his best advantage. Second, attrition. When the term attrition is used in the same line with a crime, it represents or is synonymous with loss. So when we say a crime of attrition, we're talking about a crime that the police does not solve well or solve regularly enough. So that armed robbery is the kind of crime that for every armed robber that the police arrest and pass through the criminal justice system, there are about 4 or 5 other armed robbers that were never ever caught by the police. Hence, a crime of attrition. Armed robbery is yet another thing, falls into yet another classification. It is an interracial crime as opposed to an intraracial crime. So that armed robbery is often committed against people from a different ethnic group. And when that happens, there are some other spin-off effects. You talk about the social cost dimension, the effects that armed robbery places people to live in a kind of condition where you don't want to go out of your house, you don't want to stay out late, you don't want to walk the street, you don't want to do this, you don't want to do that, you don't want to socialize with people and the like, because you are afraid of being victimized. So I think what we need to do is have a more scientific approach to addressing crimes which face immigrant populations. We have seen the Brazilians, I recall at least 10 or 12 Brazilian businessmen lost their lives in this country over the years. We have seen people from other parts of the world come here and have had lots of problems. So I really think the good thing to do is to have a meeting of the minds where not only the Chinese, but businessmen in general, even though the Chinese is a specialized group, a specialized ethnic group. But I think because the country is so small, we need all the business people to come on board and perhaps form an entity such as Business Against Crime. Business Against Crime was started in South Africa many years ago, and it has gone to other parts of the world. It's done a good job, and business people pool resources, and the government put something into it, and there are lots of volunteers, and they try to do work to reduce criminal victimization of businesses. When we come back, we will deal briefly with some of the things that could be done to prevent armed robbery. It was indeed a pleasure spending time with you. I'm Claremont Featherstone, bidding you an enjoyable rest of the evening.